The New South Wales government has accepted all 28 recommendations from a review of this year's catastrophic flooding led by the state's former Chief Scientist Mary O'Kane and former Police Commissioner Mick Fuller. Some of the key recommendations include a reshaping of Resilience New South Wales, mitigation of high-risk floodplains and a dedicated task force to ensure emergency management is embedded in the state government. Joining me live is the former Police Commissioner Mick Fuller. Thanks so much for your time. First of all, what was the biggest problem that you found with the agency's flood response?
Yeah, good morning, Laura. Look, from the agency's perspective, the SES has a proud tradition in relation to responding to floods and particularly storms. In this instance, particularly northern New South Wales, we saw the storms that provided such weather patterns and rainfall that it was just beyond the capability of the SES alone. And then, of course, that was followed up some 4 weeks later by an even more severe weather event. So I think what we saw was an agency that was probably undercooked in terms of the resources they needed to respond. And what we have learned out of the inquiry is that for these type of events, it needs to be all agency. They need to be on the ground before the storm, and we need to get the warnings right for the community, because that's particularly important, Laura. You can't have thousands of people needing to be evacuated in flooded areas. We need to get people out early.
There was some talk about a professionalisation of the SES and other emergency services, but what did you find in your report in terms of the need to maintain a volunteer level and a community response?
Firstly, without the volunteers, we don't have emergency management in New South Wales or Australia, so the volunteers have to be key. Mary and I spent an enormous amount of time visiting different units, talking to the volunteers who themselves felt let down in terms of the capabilities they had to deal with such a significant storm event. And of course the community who in so many cases when government was stretched or when we failed, they stepped in and made many rescues. And in the report, there are a number of different examples of where community members were in their own boats, on surfboards, in kayaks, out doing rescues, and they saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. So we need to factor in that the community is so important, volunteers are so important. However, we need to also get the investment right in the SES so Carleen York can continue to grow the capability, for all weather events.
You know how important a chain of command is. Was there a problem in that chain of command, and is it easily fixed?
Look, I think one of the problems we found with the SES is that they have around 330 full-time employees, and only around 30 of those focus full-time operationally. So I think, in fairness to the SES, they profile as a part-time organisation, and one of the recommendations we made is a part merger with RFS, who are an enormous agency. They have been involved in so many long campaigns with bushfires. They have a mature approach to planning and intelligence, and they can tap into that straight away, because I think that's the important thing, Laura, is that we are not out of this at the moment. The weather patterns are still looking like we're going to see significant rainfalls from between now and Christmas, and the east coast lows that have been coming in and stalling over towns, dropping enormous amounts of rain. So I think the reality is that these recommendations being endorsed by the Premier is kudos to him, but at the same time is that we need to move quickly on some of these recommendations to ensure that we're ready for the next big event.
Is there a kind of a point now where you need to level with people and say, if there was another big event like this, the SES still won't be able to be everywhere at all times? There's going to be a huge reliance of still people jumping in their tinnies and neighbours looking after each other.
And we never want to stifle that. And one of the recommendations is actually providing funding to some of these communities. We've met with community leaders who live in high-risk catchments, Laura, who want to be part of the solution, and what we're looking at as community first responders and seeking grant money for these communities to make sure that they're professionalised. Not everybody wants to join and become a full-time volunteer. We need to respect that people are busier these days. So, but at the same time that we really need these volunteers, it's important. Now, when it comes to flood rescue, I know that the State Rescue Board is looking closely at it, and we need to train many more agencies in flood rescue. And if you thought about Metropolitan Sydney, New South Wales Fire and Rescue are totally capable of assisting with flood rescue. RFS could assist with flood rescue regionally, and of course New South Wales Police and other agencies as well. But we need to significantly expand that capability, particularly knowing that we've got some difficult weather patterns coming.
Just finally, did you find anything in your report that found that volunteers treated this like a 9-to-5 job?
No, not at all. And I think the volunteers at times have been unfairly criticised. I mean, these people live in the communities. They have full-time jobs. The volunteers themselves, some were isolated and couldn't get to the unit to get out to assist, and others, of course, worked tirelessly. You know, these were two major weather events. We can't deny that. But at the same time, I think the people of New South Wales deserve better. I think our focus needs to be on the community, whether you're a full-time employee or whether you're a volunteer. And I think that's one of the great learnings, is if we continue to focus on community first, expanding our flood rescue capability, then you'll see a much better outcome. And one last thing, Laura, if I could, I think there is some complacency in some communities around floods versus bushfires, and I would just ask community members who are living in high-risk catchments, your areas are still saturated, your dams are full, your rivers are running full. You just need to be mindful of the warnings and evacuate early. Even if that's an inconvenience, evacuating early will save many more lives.
Mick Fuller, appreciate your time. Good to talk to you this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Laura.